Hi there. So a few weeks back I posted a video on the double-handed grip used as a block against rondel daggers. And the discussion that followed was very good. I must say a lot of good points came up and the discussion was very fruitful. I still think that I'm still right in this, but I realize that some people disagree with me, and I will try to show how I think we probably actually agree a little bit more than it seems in a moment when I show you the technique. The thing is, there's a few other things around this that seems there's some myths and some misconceptions around surrounding the rondel dagger. Now, first of all, there's this misconception that I think maybe I was part of creating, but anyway, it's a lot of people seem to think that rondel daggers are completely incapable of cutting, that they don't have any blades or any edges. And that's only true to a certain extent. They are obviously thrusting implements, but I think around 40% of the surviving examples have functional edges. So I think that means about 40% of them could cut. Now that means still the majority did not, but that a substantial minority did. Now, still, that does not mean that they are first and foremost cutting weapons. They are thrusting weapons, and the edge is foremost there to assist in the thrust. But they can cut, and there are rondel dagger manuals that do show cutting with the rondel dagger. So let's not fool ourselves to think that rondel daggers can never cut. Now, I realize that the manual that you may be following, or that I may be following, may not talk about cutting. That may be that for unknown reasons, but you don't get to choose what weapon your opponent has. Now, in addition to rondel daggers often having edges, there is the fact that quite a lot of the manuals are actually not rondel dagger specific or exclusive. Several of them, like Meyer for example, shows pictures of double-edged daggers, probably like a Basilard. During this, and the Basilard and the Bollock dagger were both very popular daggers, perhaps at least in the case of the Bollock dagger, much more popular and common than the rondel dagger. So during this time you would have other dagger-like weapons that people would carry and use. And as I said, even though the dagger shows you how to perhaps fight with a rondel dagger, I'm assuming that they wouldn't make a system that didn't work against other daggers, because, as I said, your opponent might actually be carrying a completely different kind of weapon, a completely different kind of dagger. So I think and both Bollock daggers and Basilards can very obviously cut. Some of the Bollock daggers have blades that kind of actually look a little bit like some of the more some of the rondel daggers. If you take the rondel daggers that have the most edge, if you like, or the most functional edge, and you look at the Bollock daggers with the least functional edge, they actually kind of overlap. And so in the large scheme of things, they are all thrusting weapons. They're made to thrust, but they can cut. They can cut. So if your defense doesn't take that into account, then I think, I'm sorry, but I think you're basically interpreting the manual wrong. because I think that none of these fencing masters would go around assuming that you'd never meet somebody with an edged rondel dagger, because they were common all throughout the time period, and so were, as I said, other daggers. And again, you don't get to choose what dagger your opponent has. And they're all more, I mean, basilards and bullock daggers and rondel daggers all seem to be more or less the same size. So I think it's very fair to assume that they are all weapons that were fit into the dagger context. So they can cut, and also this has other implications, because this means that you had quite a lot of people carrying daggers. In fact, I would say that probably the dagger was the most commonly carried weapon in the Middle Ages. This would also mean that you'd have a much larger portion of the population would have training and or experience in using the rondel dagger or any sort of dagger than you would with, for example, say a longsword. So if you met an opponent that carried a dagger, the likelihood of that opponent actually having skill, either from training or at least from experience in using it, is very, very high, perhaps the highest of any weapon carried in Europe. Now, of course, there may be, certain weapons were carried by certain social classes and they all had received training. I realize there might be factors like this, but if you met somebody with a sword, they could have picked it up, because, as we know, swords, at least depending upon the time in the Middle Ages, they were in the beginning status items, and later on were just very common. So at least in the High Middle Ages, you could meet somebody with a rondel dagger or with a long sword, and they could have basically no skill. They could just have picked it up from somewhere. And those same people would probably also carry a dagger, and they probably had more skill with a dagger because they carried it a lot more. So the likelihood of them coming into a self-defense situation during their lifetime was just that much greater. So actually, in HEMA, perhaps the rondel dagger should have a more prominent position, but never mind. As for commonality, there's also this other thing that people say that, oh well, people wore thicker clothing, and that's true, and fabrics do protect against cuts to a very large extent. However, there is also this, we tend to push this argument a little bit too long, because yes, if the defender is wearing a gambeson, you're gonna have to really punch through to use a lot of power, and probably the cuts won't work at all. But the clothing during the medieval time period, they weren't, I mean, people wore clothes, but I mean, I do a little bit of reenactment, and you look at a guy like a fine like Buxton man. I mean, yeah, sure, he has some clothes on, but he's not wearing a t-shirt, but he has linen and one layer of wool basically on his upper body, and then he has a cloak and then hosen. I mean, it's not impossible to cut through, and also I would like to point out that during the Middle Ages, especially the High Middle Ages, people really favored tight fitting. And this really makes a huge difference, because if you look at, for example, Skallagrim's video where he shows how cuts almost are ineffectual against I think it's a jack wolf skin, like autumn jacket, wind jacket, and windbreaker, and a polo shirt. The reason why that works, and I think he even points this out, is because the fabric is allowed to move so much. That means the fabric is relatively big. Fabric was quite expensive, and for that reason and for other reasons, the fit was relatively tight, so it wouldn't move as much. And we are talking about one layer of linen and one layer of wool for the most part, and maybe some gloves, for the hands. It's not crazy. We're not talking about 10 layers of wool here. Of course, when you come into, you know, the 15th and 16th century, people put on more clothes, and especially the higher classes. You look at, you know, some of them. In some cases, they wore tremendous amounts of fabric, but that was quite late in the period, and perhaps that is why the later sources don't really teach cuts. I don't know, but it seems to me that that this isn't so time specific. Meyer, now there is a little caveat here. Meyer doesn't seem to differentiate between thrusts and cuts. He just uses the words interchangeably. However, that is the foreign translation. I don't know if that's true of the High German one. If somebody knows better than me, please share that information. But as I said, clothes, yeah, they protect. Fabrics protect against cuts, but not all cuts. It doesn't mean that cuts are ineffectual completely. It's just they are less effective than they would optimally be. You do see cutting in several of the Ronald dagger manuals, which makes me assume that this was a kind of a thing. People did that, right? So we do know it was taught. We do know that about 40% of the surviving examples, now assuming that that's a fair representative of how it looked at the time, we can say that it was relatively common to have edges, and there were lots of other daggers that were used in the same period that you'd be likely to encounter, and several of the manuals are not Ronald dagger exclusive. So please keep in mind, daggers can cut. Okay, now let's look at the video and the technique, and see you soon.
Okay, so a few comments came on this one. Now the point is, I have problems with this version. Okay, if you do this, like some of you guys do, then I don't have a problem. You see, now the blade isn't pointing at me. That's exactly, basically the same concept doing this. Here I'm okay, as if I'm doing this. Both of them are okay, it's just where I put my feet. I don't like it on this side, because then I'm stepping into his fist. However, what I did was this. And here, of course, my head is coming in to headbutt him. So that's not a big problem. However, this I don't like, because here his force is directed towards me. But if I do this, I'm okay. You see here? I did it, and that's what most people who make this one work does. They do something like this. Because if he still has force towards me, he's just gonna go in, and then I can break his elbow. Yes. No problem. See? So this, no problem at all. Okay? This I have a problem with. Okay?